Hey, everybody. Excited to have a podcast today with Aarvoll, Eric Aarvoll. And been in the Platonist space for a number of years and just excited to have a kind of open conversation about his projects he's been working on and particularly around things like Platonism. Eric, do you want to give like a quick introduction, kind of who you are and, what you've been up to?
Yeah, sure. Good to be with you. I'm trying to think when the first time I really spoke in depth about Platonism was. I was interested in it from the beginning of my own philosophical study, you might say. So I went to school for music and wasn't really into the Western philosophical canon or tradition prior to that. I got exposed to some of that through a good friend I had at my music school, Eastman, in Rochester, New York. But up until that point, I was really interested in physics and contemporary science, and I would keep up to date on, new discoveries in material physics, Bose-Einstein condensates, and things like that, and
Hmm.
cosmological models. And I would read books. On the multiverse theory and different types of multiverse and different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and that was all really fascinating. But I was kind of just a mainline materialist until the end of college, when just using the various arguments that I'd been exposed to in that pop physics world, I essentially concluded that God had to exist.
Hmm.
And then from there, I started looking into Hinduism and comparative mythology and a bunch of different stuff, but also started reading the philosophical texts that I had access to. So I read like Heidegger's little book, Intro
Hmm.
to Metaphysics. I started reading some Nietzsche,
Hmm.
and I went to like Barnes and Noble and picked out some Penguin classics, mashup of Plato's greatest hits. And I read that and really loved it. Got a lot out of it, but I didn't really see like the deeper aspect. To me, it did look like dialectical exercises or something along those lines. Um, After a few years of deeper study in the tradition, reading figures like Leibniz and Schopenhauer, I kind of came back to Plato and recognized that the tradition starts with Plato, and everyone is constantly referencing, even in later modern philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. And unless I really understand what they were claiming back then, I can't understand this more recent stuff. I was probably like 24 or 25 when I decided, okay, I'm reading the collected works of Plato and then taking it more seriously. Essentially, with that background in comparative mythology, in modern philosophy, then I kind of tapped into, okay, here's what Plato is actually saying, or at least what I could glean from it at the time. Um, Still, I would bring up Plato kind of tangentially. My content was more about my own philosophical deliberations, and just it was a vlog, talking
Hmm.
about my thoughts. And after a couple more years, I decided to look into the Neoplatonists. Like a lot of people, I tried reading Plotinus and didn't get a whole lot out of it,
Hmm.
um, because he is very obscure. He's referencing an existing literary culture, and a lot of concepts that were fleshed out in physical schools, and his audience for his essays or tractates was people in that philosophical community who are already in the know. Later on, the later Neoplatonists, especially Proclus, learned how to really spell all of these concepts out in just clear step by step details and very rational arguments. So that in particular, it was Proclus's Elements of Theology. I started reading that, and it was the first philosophical text that really I just had to like set down the book and think for a half hour on one of his propositions and really like analyze it from all angles. Um, and from then on, I've basically had greater and greater respect for the Neoplatonists. I've taught the Iamblichian curriculum online a couple times. We've gone through it now, and each time I find there is more to get from either Proclus or Olympiodorus, Simplicius, like all of these commentators. it's not just their original insight into what Plato was saying, but also it's like this window into a very interesting philosophical space that existed, especially from the 3rd century down to the 6th century AD. So yeah, that I kind of got swept along in that and realized there just weren't enough resources where people used this material. Like the Iamblichean curriculum, we have so many of the texts that they actually use to teach this stuff. And yet I couldn't find a place where you could actually be guided through that curriculum. And ultimately, my goal was to create a physical school like Iamblichus had. I think that's the ideal setting to really internalize this system. That's not yet realized, institutionally, but hopefully one day. So, yeah, like especially over the last 4 or 5 years, I've leaned more and more into the classical interpretations of Plato because they're pretty rich.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think you're one of the first people I've talked to where elements of theology was the simplified version for you that clicked and made sense. I think that's where a lot of people hit it and they go, "Oh my God, my head's spinning."
Plotinus is very meandering,
Hmm.
so he's sort of hard to like, what is he actually saying? What does he land on? Like Aristotle, you can read pages and pages of Aristotle where he's examining different possibilities, and then he doesn't give his own opinion until like there's one line, you know, 10 pages in where he mentions what he thinks. And if you
Hmm.
don't pick up on that, then you're going to lose the rest of the work. Plotinus is like that. Proclus, it's modeled on the elements of geometry,
Hmm.
so it could not be clearer. It's very, it's just the argument.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
like
he's
that
far
actually.
more systematic, and I think I had a similar experience with Plotinus too. I jumped in and tried to read the Aeneids very early on in getting into Platonism. I was going through the Iamblichean curriculum and thought, oh, I'll dip my toe into Plotinus, and I got completely lost very fast. Like you said, he's kind of referencing all of these different things. And I find you have to be kind of steeped in the tradition a little bit before you pick up Plotinus. And then he starts to make a lot of sense. And I've found going back to him later, a lot of questions that I had about Platonism end up getting answered by Plotinus. And it's clear that the tradition had kind of been stewing on them for really hundreds of years. And then finally, Plotinus comes out and says, okay, I'm going to straighten this out and just walk you through the thought process of where I'm at with this.
Right. Yeah, I agree. That's my historical interpretation as well. Plotinus references a certain set of dialogues consistently. Sometimes he goes outside of that traditional canon, but many of the dialogues he talks about are in the Iamblichean curriculum. So it looks like Iamblichus didn't just arbitrarily patch these together. The Middle Platonists also tend to allude to these same stock dialogues and particular passages within them. So yeah, that's how it looks to me as well. These ideas were kind of gradually solidifying. Like you read Plutarch, there's no sense of a systematic philosophy. He's clearly familiar with Platonism and insights into human nature, and some vague notions of piety, but there's nothing like piecing it all together. Same with Cicero, like the famous, more ancient Platonist. Now, we don't know about the Old Academy very
Mm,
much at all because not much survives. So I tend to think probably there was a period where it was very systematic, I imagine. I mean, they invented new math at least in the Old Academy. And then maybe around the 2nd century BC, 3rd century, it declines. And then, yeah, like 1st, 2nd century, people are starting to piece something more codified back together. And then, yeah, Plotinus, Ammonius Saccas too.
mm,
Although, again, we don't really have
yeah.
documents from him. The role of Christianity in all of this is interesting to me as well.
Mm,
I am a Christian. I lean much more heavily on the Platonic sources than like the church fathers. But Ammonius Saccas is referenced as a Christian author as well as a Neoplatonic author. And the same is true of Origin, right? And people are divided. Is there like two characters out there named Ammonius Saccas? One a Christian writer, one a Neoplatonist, and same for Origin. I tend to think they're probably were only one Ammoniusakis and one Origin, and they experienced conversion events during their lifetime.
Hmm.
So Ammoniusakis probably started as a Christian and became a Neoplatonist, or inaugurated Neoplatonism. And then Origin, I think, probably started as a Neoplatonist and then became a Christian. Porphyry relates the anecdote where Plotinus is lecturing and Origin walks in and Plotinus gets flustered because he knows like how comprehensive Origin's knowledge is of Platonism. So I do wonder about like exactly what kind of role the philosophically oriented church played as well. And I guess the pseudo Dionysius question is kind of involved there because if he was really a first century figure, well,
Hmm.
then later Neoplatonism was already completely fleshed out by a Christian author in the first century,
Right. Yeah. I
uh,
mean,
which I think is unlikely,
yeah,
but
I was going to say,
pretty
I
crazy.
think that's pretty unlikely. I mean, it seems a little bit too, I think there's some lines in it that were pulled straight from Proclus, and
It does look like that to
yeah,
me.
it
Yeah.
appears to be that way. So, I mean, it would be super interesting, but it also seems out of place. Reading Pseudo Dionysius, he
Yes.
does seem very much in that kind of, the 400s, 500s type of period. That's where I
Yeah.
would expect it to land. It'd be bizarre to imagine that that's being written at the same time as people like Alcinous and, Epictetus and stuff like that. It's a little bit too theologically fleshed out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, no one has done a word count analysis to my knowledge on the pseudo Dionysian corpus compared to 5th century or 1st century authors. It would be relatively easy with AI
Hmm.
now, but yeah, I mean, I agree. So Numenius though was influenced by Christianity.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of cross-pollination.
Oh, yeah.
Um and it's not, I mean, even later down the road as well, like obviously you have John Philoponus, who in many ways advances some of Proclus's arguments beyond where he left them, effectively rebuts Proclean notions without resorting to dogmatism. So you do have to give like the Christian Platonists due respect, but yeah, I enjoy the pagan Neoplatonic authors probably a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm probably one of the odder people in the pagan space, and that, like, I'm not antagonistic towards Christianity at all. And I don't really find that to be a productive thing. Like, I think we can kind of come to certain agreements and we can have our disagreements for sure. But I don't think we necessarily have to be at each other's throats about any of that stuff. And I agree that there was a lot of stuff going back and forth between the early Christians and pagans, Platonists, back and forth both ways. Even looking at things like the Philokalia, which is very important to the Orthodox and their practices, I see a lot of things that are in Plotinus in that. And I would not at all be surprised to find that those guys were reading Plotinus and kind of applying some of these Platinian ideas of return to the one to the concept of theosis. So I do see a ton of that kind of cross pollination there for sure.
Right. Yeah, and I wonder also if many Platonists were drawn into Christianity because of this issue that Platonic philosophy is not easy to evangelize and spread to the masses. And yet Christianity does basically distill down these essential principles that I think are Platonic in spirit, like being open to the spirit and being willing to argue why you believe what you believe. When I read the very earliest church fathers, like Clement of Rome, I get the sense that the what the church provided was a space where philosophy could actually take place. And I think that's why the Gnostics emerged so quickly, and a lot of people influenced by Hermeticism and things like that, because like philosophy by itself doesn't provide the space where philosophy can take place. If you drop
Mm,
me in a tribe of like, uncontacted hunter gatherers in New Guinea, I can't philosophically engage with them. Certain like behavioral norms have to be established. And what Christianity does is it provides this space where you are going to respectfully listen to what someone has to say about like the nature of reality and what does God actually have to communicate to us, because this notion of the Holy Spirit. And then, of course, the notion of forgiveness. I mean, it's not identical to the kind of clemency that Socrates often grants his interlocutors and the generosity that he affords them. But it is, again, like similar in spirit. So,
Mhm. Yeah, it's funny. That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you about this kind of concept of forgiveness, because I've been looking into it on the Platonic side, and I do think that it's actually an important Christian concept, and it is one that does seem a little bit missing from a lot of pagan ethical sources in the Platonic works. You don't really find them talking that much about forgiveness as a concept. It's, even in something like Plato's Laws, he seems much more concerned with, say, order of the city. And I think forgiveness is a part of that. And you can kind of read it into what he's saying, that at some level, when I read Laws, I was surprised that Plato was sometimes lenient about certain things. He seemed like lenient about even like murder in some cases, and lightened the sentence. You would kind of expect him to be very hard line about it and have these really extreme punishments for it. But you can tell he's always trying to have this more rehabilitatory idea towards people, that the idea is to bring people back into justice, back into order, and not just, get rid of the undesirables kind of mindset. So there's a little bit of that, but I think it is kind of a precursor, I guess, what you might say, to what you see later in the more explicit idea of forgiveness in the Christian works. Although there is some stuff in Pythagoras, I think you could say is getting a little bit close to there as well.
like what?
I should pull up some of the bits I was just reading the other day in the Pythagorean maxims and sentences. There's a couple of little sayings in there that have that kind of, like even in the Golden Verses, saying, you shouldn't hate your friend for a slight fault. Not exactly
Right.
forgiveness, but
Yeah.
he kind of edges toward that idea.
hmm Yeah, I think the sociological implications of the later developed like forgiveness doctrine were grasped by the Pythagoreans. I mean, the whole goal was to like perfect communal life, and
Hmm.
friendship was one of the highest virtues, and harmony between people. So, um, Socrates again exemplifies the same kind of virtues, but they don't really make it a metaphysical principle. I think it's more a consequence that's downstream from their beliefs about divinity, and how divinity, for example, bestows its benefits on all things. And it's up to us either to turn towards God or the gods, or turn away. And so if we want to be like God, we have to have this kind of spiritual egalitarianism where we afford our benefits to all in some respect and have this magnanimity at least,
Hmm.
but that is within a social context that's for the health of the organism, for the harmony of society. Whereas the Christian concept is, on the one hand, more individualistic, but also I think it takes this idea of forgiveness and places it at a higher level. It's not merely us imitating the nature of the gods, it's also woven into the fabric of fate and how fate operates. That if we forgive others, we will ourselves be forgiven.
Hmm.
So I think the prior notion again is like this benevolence or charity is just, if we're going to live up to the nature of God, and like the goal of philosophy is assimilation to God's nature for the Pythagoreans,
Hmm.
the Middle Platonists, and then it becomes for Christians something that is actually like our action feeds back onto higher ordering principles and how they in turn treat us. So because there is this feedback cycle, it has a more fundamental place in the dynamics. And then there's also, of course, the emphasis on the individual soul, where like it's not quite there in Judaism. Forgiveness is there in Judaism, but then I think it's also for the sake of the community more than anything else, because most ancient Jews didn't seem to believe in the immortality of the soul. Plato, on the other hand, you don't get an explicit forgiveness doctrine as a social teaching,
Hmm.
maybe intimations of it, but not
Hmm.
quite. And yet there is that emphasis on the individual soul. So it's like there's some kind of synthesis on the Jewish side and Platonic side that comes out in Christianity. And I think it's uh, a one of those situations you judge a tree by its fruits, and the societies that actually internalize this doctrine and practice it, they escape generations of retaliatory blood feuds and things like that, and actually progress as individuals as well. It's like if you it's not that you should always trust people who have wronged you. And
Hmm.
that's the criticism of it, is that you're opening yourself up to abuse. It's pathological altruism, it's whatever. And but like just strictly speaking, if it's possible to get someone back on your side and to work with them, why would you sacrifice that? Why would you not accept someone back into the fold if it is possible? And that's, forgiveness is paired with repentance. If they are repentant and will not do the same thing again, well, then it becomes a sunk cost if you're not willing to reconcile. And the other part of it is, of course, like if you want that same forgiveness expressed towards you, then karmically, you should behave the same way towards others. It's like very intuitively appealing to me. A, because I need forgiveness for things that I've messed up in life. I think that's a lot of people.
Sure.
Um, but then B, like I think you can go really deep with this kind of metaphysical role of forgiveness and how fundamental it can be. We could discuss like the actual arguments that I would use to get there, but let me just summarize it by saying it's my position that we are in a world that reflects our nature. I actually do buy the many worlds. I know Plato says there's one world,
Hmm.
but then remember the myth from the Phaedo where he talks about the many different depressions in the
Hmm.
one giant Earth. And I think
Sure.
that's what he's talking about. There are
Okay.
many realms, and many pagan systems reflect that notion. Many kind of parallel realms that are branching off this one kind of multiverse structure or something like that. So I think we anthropically end up in the world that we do because that is our nature. And you tend, just statistically, like you tend to find yourself clustered with like natures. You're more likely to be in a group of 20 people than a group of 3 people. That's why when you go to the bank, it's always crowded, because
Hmm.
statistically you're going to be at the bank when it's crowded. Or like if you're a chicken, you're going to find yourself in a big flock of chickens. You find yourself in the universe that reflects your nature. And Socrates even indicates that in the Phaedo, where he says effectively that because of the way that he has lived and dedicated himself towards philosophy and the good of the Athenian people, he expects to have even higher gods than the ones that are supervening the mortal world that he inhabits. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm somewhat ambivalent, I guess, on the idea of multiple worlds. Like, I'm open to the idea that maybe there are kind of like there's a multiverse out there, and I could also see that not being the case. I think when we're talking about just the vastness of the universe, and we know so little even about the universe we live in, much less what could potentially be beyond it. So I don't think we can ever rule it out and say no, that's not what's going on. But I like that idea that in general, it's a very Platonic concept that, we are kind of grouped together with souls that we are like. And, I see that even in the myth of the Phaedrus and the leader gods that we follow, that we kind of follow in this chain of these like similar essences, and we're grouped together by those. And, that informs a big part of how I view the gods and how they kind of mix into our theology overall, is that they're kind of these leader essences that we're grouped by and following essentially. So, does that kind of inform how you've structured your community and all? Like, I've been curious about how Platonism might, Platonism and religion in general kind of interacts with your community that you built.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, we're not all Platonists here, although disproportionately many of us are Platonists, and I think that has helped in the nature of the discourse. More of the Christians are familiar with Platonic arguments, and more of the pagans are Platonic pagans, you might say. Um, and
So you
so
guys are
there
a
is this kind of
mix
common
of
ground.
you guys are a mix of kind of pagans and Christians for the
Yeah,
most part. Okay.
right. Which I think would have been very difficult had the starting group not included people like disproportionately from my audience, where I talked about Platonism and Christianity and paganism. So, not to take full credit for it, it's just we attracted a certain group of people who wanted to have dialogue that was productive. Um, Whereas compared to like just the general discourse on X, what naturally rises to the top is the most polemical,
Yeah.
the most polarized.
Sure.
Because you have these different communities kind of spiraling and
Mm. And
signaling.
it's all anons too. It's like a lot of
Right.
people who don't even show their face and they feel real
Hmm.
tough talking on X, they'll talk a bunch of trash. If you saw those people in person, it's like they would never be like that. They probably wouldn't say anything at all.
Obviously. Yeah. Right. So I think that's part of it. As far as like applying Platonic or Pythagorean principles in day to day life here, I wish we were even at that stage where that level of civilizational organization was pressing. We're kind of more primitive than that. It's
Okay.
like when in the Republic, Socrates starts describing the ideal society, and it's like, well, this guy will be a fisherman and this person will make
Right.
shoes.
Yeah.
That's more the level we're at, and that's just,
Sure.
um, so yeah, I don't have a great answer other than when I engage, I try to find that common ground, and it does help to have a certain respect for our common
Mhm.
philosophical heritage. Um, but yeah, maybe when I start the school physically, uh, more of those direct implications will be lived out.
Right. And going back to what you said about Christianity early on being a kind of maybe a container for Platonism is a way you could kind of describe it, a place where that could thrive in those communities. I that's something I've realized as well. I think one of the failures of paganism and Platonism in the ancient world was that it was very cloistered off into these academic circles that was basically you had to be a rich person to be involved in them. In order to study philosophy and get a philosophical tutor or mentor was very expensive. You had to have a lot of extra money laying around, send your kid off to go study with Plotinus or whoever, and then they'd come back knowing some stuff about philosophy. But your average everyday person really didn't have access to that kind of stuff. They were lucky if they could maybe have some time to go to a library and read some of these works if they were even literate. And so I think with those communities that are very based on kind of bringing all these different groups of people together, even the lower class type of people, now you suddenly have this space where you can start talking about philosophical concepts with them, and it's essentially free. You'd have these probably bishops and higher ups in the church who really, really understood this stuff. Maybe they were from that background and got trained in philosophy like a lot of the early church fathers did. And then they kind of disseminate that to their congregations, essentially, the groups of people that they're with. And, that's the kind of model that I've looked at and said, I think we kind of have to take a page out of that book from early Christianity and go, okay, if you want to start something like that, well, having that same kind of framework for people where there's a low pressure place where you can come in and start to learn about these concepts, and you don't have to go to Harvard and get a philosophy degree to figure this stuff out. Like, we can kind of disseminate it to people in a more bare bones kind of way.
Right. Yeah. The Christian Science reading room, I guess, is a good example. You could
Mhm.
create acid true reading rooms or something.
Yeah, I
Um,
guess.
I don't know if it would be effective, but maybe. Um, yeah, like what you get when you ask your pastor or priest about the nature of God, if they do dialogue with you, is typically, you're getting like the five key or not Aristotelian, but rather Aquinian or Thomistic arguments, which Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced not just by Aristotle, but also Plato and
Hmm.
indirectly the Neoplatonists. And it's the same style of argument you get within that cloistered, highbrow philosophical school from antiquity, but distilled down and just like the key ideas presented. There is definitely a degradation of the quality that happens. And, Jesus says, don't cast your pearls before swine. So it's
Hmm.
ironic that and he says he tells parables so that the many will not understand. And their belief is that most people won't be saved. And yet, so, so like Socrates in the dialogue is willing to teach the slave boy
Hmm.
geometry, right? He's willing to engage with people at different levels in society. Certainly, he cares more about young men who might be promising politicians because he cares about Athens and that's more consequential.
Hmm.
But like the character of Jesus in the Gospels is almost in some ways more elitist than
Hmm.
Socrates.
Yeah.
He comes only to his particular people, and it's all mixed messages. But you do get the impression that Christianity was supposed to be some kind of mystery school,
Hmm.
initiatic order.
Hmm.
There's early like icons from Christian sites that do reflect the kind of cycle of initiation that you would have in Mithraism and
Hmm.
different degrees of, what level of adept are you? What kind of,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
inauguration have you had into the tradition? So I think it was something like that, but it was something like that that was a developed social technology and was feeding into a general milieu of like secret societies that in some sense were populist too,
Hmm.
or populist, because the mysteries were open to all not just Athenian citizens, but like every person essentially. It tended to be an elite group that would disproportionately be represented there, but they had that way of drawing people in, bringing them in, having a sense of deep mystery and deep significance, and not just like watering down, because that's the kind of rub, that's the trade-off. If you want Platonism for the masses, how do you avoid bastardizing the arguments and having something at the end of the day which is just pablum and not useful scientifically? It's just simply designed to satisfy people's philosophical curiosity so
Hmm.
that you become the sophist,
Right.
basically. Like, oh, I have the answer. You
Right.
have these questions, I have the answers for you.
Sure. Yeah, you're
Um,
not doing the kind of dialectical process at that point. It becomes more of just a dogmatic type of thing, and it's tough to avoid
right.
that. I mean, I do see at some
Christianity took
level.
that
Well, they
path,
did. Yeah.
but I don't think that's how they started popularizing it. I think it was this initiatic thing,
Hmm.
which again, paradoxically, was more open than the Platonic schools.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean there. I mean, I've always somewhat jokingly said that Christianity is Jewish Orphism. It's got that kind of vibe of a little bit of a mixture of kind of the Orphic mystery cult, the Bacchic kind of energy there, but obviously based on the Old Testament side of things, making it a prophecy based on that. And I'm wondering how you kind of reconcile some of that stuff as far as Platonism goes and Christianity, because there are obviously big differences between them, and I think those are the things that kind of keep me, I guess, out of being a Christian. Is if you read the Nicene Creed out, I'd probably say I don't agree with every single part of it, but even deeper than that, saying things like reincarnation, which I know you believe in reincarnation. I would say the sort of eternality of the cosmos, that there isn't really like an eschaton or anything, that being a more of a Platonic concept. And so I'm just curious kind of how you blend those together, because you definitely have some things that are more on the Platonic side and that go against Christian dogma. And I'm sure it's difficult to kind of sort out how that works.
Well, yeah, I'm not a dogmatist, period.
Hmm.
So uh, there's a Gnostic quote from one of the Gnostic gospels or sayings of Jesus that says we have to be as good money changers, sorting out the genuine from the counterfeit. So, I mean, that's how I think a critically thinking person engages with any literature, scientific or whatever.
Hmm.
The problem is in the Christian tradition, this heavy dogmatism did evolve because of the teaching authority um, of church elders, and that institutionalized. And, once you kind of have that one-sided, um, not authority in the sense of like auctoritas being the authority that you lend to a teacher, like it's a voluntary kind
Hmm.
of authority, but one that's simply institutionally given. It's, I guess, hard to go back to critically assessing what is that organization stem from, because then they retcon their own narrative and
Hmm.
censor. And like people say, Jesus is the most well attested historical character from that time period. There are more
Hmm.
manuscripts related to the life of Jesus than any other person. It's like, yeah, that's true. But also, we know that Theodosian Christianity was extremely censorious, and they destroyed all sorts of documents that now we'll never know what various pagan groups thought. Um, so yeah, for me, just because I never bought the dogmatism, and actually I came to Christianity through my own line of philosophical arguments
Hmm.
inspired by Platonic arguments, um, I guess it doesn't feel odd to me. But
Hmm.
yeah, reincarnation, like there are Gnostics who believed in reincarnation.
Hmm.
Origen arguably believed in reincarnation, and he wasn't even a Gnostic. There are indicators of some kind of notion of reincarnation, even in the New Testament, when someone was born blind and they were asking, is this because this person sinned or because their parents sinned? And just like very vaguely, the notion is there, like,
Right.
and Jesus never contradicts the idea of reincarnation as an explicit teaching. Later on, the church had that as a dogma that, you're born once essentially. And yet I don't see really strong historical groundwork for that. Uh, Reincarnation is a much wider view. Today, most Jews, I think, if they're,
Yeah.
Kabbalistic Jews, they believe in reincarnation.
Yeah, I've seen some
So
quotes even from or polls for Catholics, and there's even a good amount of Catholics that believe in reincarnation, which I think is funny.
it is funny. Catholics have the most tightly defined dogmatic system, and then the most people that don't understand at all what the dogmas are.
No, don't listen to it
Um,
at all, even if they knew it.
right. Yeah. I mean, they don't read the catechism.
No.
Um, but yeah. So, I mean, what other issues? Reincarnation seems like a non-issue. The ending of the world in The Statesman, Plato describes this cycle of the cosmos where you have a Cronian age
Hmm.
when the order is kind of divinely instituted, and then a Zeusian age as that kind of winds down.
Hmm.
And then at a certain point, divine intervention comes back in and winds the clock back up. Um, so like again, Jesus doesn't say that won't happen, and there is some indication with regard to their eschatological picture that, like for example, there's the millennial kingdom where God reigns, and then Satan comes back for a while, and then like we go back to this heavenly state where Jesus is the world monarch. He teaches everyone directly, but then what's that education actually for? It's like I don't think it's real explicit that this is just some eternal end state of history that's introduced.
Right. Okay.
Um, that's obviously the way most Christians would view it. I think, you know, they often take interpretive, creative um, moves, especially looking at the Old Testament, like the Catholic Church is comfortable acknowledging that the language in Genesis could be allegorical. There's
Yeah.
also parallels between the Timaeus and the account in Genesis, like
Hmm.
major parallels. And Plato, and of course, they had the people who wrote Genesis, in my opinion, or the form that we have it in today, they were familiar with Plato. So I don't think those parallels are accidental. I think it's drawing explicitly from a Platonic framework. And in that source material behind Genesis, I believe, which is the Timaeus, Plato's pretty explicit that this language of time and a creation, a start point of time, we have to use for the sake of our understanding, but a full explanation of how like duration and time relates to creation would take many, many hours, and so they don't get into it.
Mm,
Ironically, the Middle Platonists seem to like take the face value text of the Timaeus as the story, and they did believe in a creation. There also maybe there were Christian influences, and it's an interesting puzzle. But like
so
I said, I think there are enough moves that can be taken in interpretation to say that the authors of Genesis were doing the same kind of thing that Plato did
mhm.
explicitly in the Timaeus.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a lot of parallels there, and I'm curious. You're kind of a Marcionite a little bit about the Old Testament, right? And I'm curious if you've looked at the kind of information about. Obviously, you've read Gomurkin, it sounds like, and the idea about the Genesis and Timaeus being influenced by each other, or really Genesis being influenced by Timaeus specifically. So, do you take this kind of later opinion about the writing of the Old Testament that maybe it was written, say, like 300 years before Christ and it's not really as old as they say it is?
Yeah, I think it's younger than that.
Hmm.
Jonathan Adler, the Israeli archaeologist, yeah, I mean, his dating suggests it could be as late as the mid second century BC,
Right.
which would line up, of course, with the Maccabees and like, okay,
Hmm.
when they had their own state, they could solidify this canon and distribute it effectively. And like there are narratives in the Old Testament about periods of time when the law was lost. And
Hmm.
then a priest like finds it in a back room somewhere, and they're like,
Right.
"Oh, there are all
I was
these
here the
laws we
whole
should have been
time.
following." Yeah,
Yeah.
which is convenient for someone who wanted to introduce a bunch of new laws to insert that story. Um, yeah, I think probably a lot of the narratives are older. Like
Right.
Job, I think is
Yeah.
genuinely ancient, probably 7th or 8th century BC, if not earlier. Some of the characters, I mean, Yahweh is definitely older than the 2nd century. There are inscriptions attesting Yahweh worship, but then those same inscriptions tend to reflect some form of henotheism, not
Hmm.
monotheism.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, my view is that prior to the 2nd century, when they intentionally set themselves apart because they were concerned about Hellenism and like losing their identity and being blended out, and like books like Ezra in the Old Testament are very explicit about that. They're concerned that the Hebrew people is being adulterated. So so I'm losing my train of thought a little bit here.
Well, I was going to say it makes sense that you would take kind of take the stance that you're taking then. If you're coming at Christianity sort of without the dogma, you're kind of coming at it from a philosophical standpoint and then applying that dialectical and philosophical way of thinking to it, then yeah, you're going to come to this different perspective, I guess, or you're kind of where you're at.
I remember my train of thought now. So what I was going to say was going back, I think the Israelite religion was something more in harmony with the general Eastern Mediterranean milieu, which
Mhm.
is the same theological environment that the Phoenicians and the Greeks and everyone uh, was coming out of that developed philosophy. And then like Iamblichus relates that Pythagoras actually studied with the Mosaics.
Mhm. Does he say
Um,
that? I
Yes, in the
oh,
life of Iamblichus. Or sorry, the life of Pythagoras, rather.
Pythagoras. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So there is this idea that maybe what Jesus is doing is reforming a religion that became very recently, only a couple centuries or a century and a half before his time,
Mm,
legalistic, inserting all of these fictions and expanding the law from a kind of metaphysical concept of order. It's like logos or nomos is a metaphysical thing, and yet also nomos means the literal law that's in your constitution.
mm,
Well, in Hebrew, Torah has a double meaning. Torah is the metaphysical ordering principles of nature, and it's also this particular set of texts that lay out laws. So it's kind of a natural way to interpret what Jesus was doing and makes sense why the Gnostics would choose their interpretation.
Hmm.
It makes sense why many people have said that Jesus can be interpreted like he's a guru or something. He's
Hmm.
teaching the identity of our soul with the Heavenly Father in some kind of monistic sense. Um, so I think that's what Jesus was doing. He was trying to restore his particular tradition into harmony with the general, Sophia Perennis
Hmm.
environment that most civilized societies would take for granted, and that's just how it was. These mystery schools were open to people of different nationalities. It was a kind of pan-Mediterranean culture where they recognized different names for these gods in different places and respect the names and treat them differently and worship differently in different places. However, the metaphysics ultimately converges, and if that's what Jesus was teaching, well, then he was doing something very different than what the Orthodox Christians would later say he was doing.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that if Jesus were around, I don't think he'd necessarily agree with whatever the orthodoxy in the church is. At least if just reading the Gospels plainly, and I kind of look at it a bit from an outsider perspective at this point. If I'm just looking at his words, I don't see how all of that lines up. I know they kind of make it work, but it also seems very heavily based on people like Paul. And, I don't really put a whole lot of stock in what Paul thinks for the most part. But I'm curious, like, does that factor in for you, like Paul's letters and stuff like that? Are you taking a lot of that as kind of like divine literature, or are you being a little bit more critical in particular
Take
about
that.
those?
I take that as divinely inspired in the sense that it's the earliest window we have into the Christian community. Now, it was a window into that community that I think was engaging with it in a way critically. Obviously, initially, Paul was a critic and enemy of Christians, but I think he had an agenda in
Hmm.
how he was trying to shape the church, and his pointed arguments to the church were intended to standardize um, a belief system, but he was interfacing with an existing belief system. He'll talk about these aeons and like different orders of intelligences in a way that the later Gnostics definitely flesh out into a full metaphysical system. I think that's probably not just Paul being original. That's probably Paul reflecting discourse that did exist within the church. But we're only getting Paul's side of the story. Still, though, it's the earliest indication we have of the Christian tradition. These are the earliest documents. And so we kind of have to read them and expect that a majority of the moral precepts, at least, will actually reflect what Christians by and large believed. Because if it was totally antithetical to the existing discourse, then they would not have accepted Paul.
Right. Well, it does
Um,
seem that the apostles had some issues with Paul.
yeah, yeah. So again, I think it was critical, but I think he also inevitably is going to lean towards. It's like if you were a fake Christian and you wanted to convert a church into some, heretical cult denomination you were forming, then you would start from what they believe and kind of gradually pull them in your direction.
Hmm.
So if anything, that's what Paul was doing. I don't know if it was intentional. It's impossible to say.
Yeah.
It is a very hard to believe story though. Um
The road to
he
Damascus part and all that, or
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure. I mean, if someone had a similar narrative today, obviously
yeah, no,
we wouldn't trust them.
no.
So
Yeah, it's interesting how it all kind of how it all kind of pans out. So I've been interested too in just kind of how you've incorporated some pagan ideas into what you're doing as far as like talking about the gods. And I think you made an interesting point about the the metaphysics of things converging. And one of the things that I've been writing about recently is trying to really separate metaphysics from theology in the sense that theology is kind of talking about gods for the most part, and metaphysics is talking about the sort of structure of reality. And in some level, I think Platonism does a good job of trying to keep those things separated. And not so much when we get to Proclus. I would say that's where Proclus goes, no, we're going to theologize metaphysics. But as far as talking about the nous and the soul and these kind of fundamental things and not necessarily giving them one-to-one relationships with gods or having it be even exclusive to paganism, right? It's able to be applied to other religions, I think, because they kept it more universal. But I'm curious, like if you kind of take a more universalized metaphysics, or if you've got, more of a Christian kind of version of metaphysics, I guess, as far as how you view those structural parts of reality.
I'm actually fairly Proclean about it. I mean, I do think soul itself, the first soul, is a god,
Mm-hmm.
and nous itself is a god.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as far as the way that we know the gods, and Proclus talks about this, is generally through daimonical apparitions. It's messengers of the gods. We know the gods by their effects because in themselves they're utterly ineffable. And also they, of course, the doctrine of the Sarai, the
Mm-hmm.
rays.
Right.
So the gods authentically are in the first hypostasis, like the ground of being, not beings, but the groundwork underneath being, is where you'll find those primordial unities, and these are like the gods seminally contained in all their potencies,
Mm-hmm.
and that we can only get some idea of by their effects in lower orders, including in myths and theophany in mystical experiences. But then in the intellectual domain, so when I say that the first intelligence is a god, Fanny's, I guess, in the
Mm-hmm.
Proclean system,
Sure.
and then like the later aspects, the more intellectual rather than intelligent, or intelligible aspect, that's going to be more like the Zeusian demiurge or whatnot. These lower orders, there's a mix of the god who has his origin in the first hypostasis, and then also the same intellectual divisions that are present in our nous.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't know the nature of the god. We can maybe know like our god. You mentioned the Phaedrus
Mm-hmm.
myth. Like there is a henad that we have that holds together our suke, or our general, like the combination of all these aspects that we have: intellectual, dianoetic, sensory. There's a unity that we participate in, and that unity, by the same logic of the Sarai, for those who don't know, this is the idea that one henad cuts through the rays, or sorry, the levels of being like a ray of light, but also disseminates and distributes a little bit and affects more things at each level. But in each level of being, there's going to be the principal exemplar of the Zeusian energy, or the Athenian, as in Athena, energy, and so on and so forth. So we have our henad that is in a divine series. We might not have a divine henad because, again, the ray expands in lower orders. And
Mm-hmm.
so the henad joining me together might not be the straight and narrow, like pure blood descendant of the god,
Right.
but it's still like in his series. So I can know the nature of, say, I'm like in the series of Aries,
Mm-hmm.
because astrologically I'm in Aries. I don't know if that's how it works
Yeah.
exactly, but whatever.
Yeah.
So I can know the nature of Aries, that personality, by looking at my personality,
Mm-hmm.
because it's kind of, this is also an interesting metaphysical question of vocabulary. The hypostasis, of course, the Platonists treat it in one respect with one meaning, and then the Christians treat it in a kind of totally different
Yeah.
way,
Totally different way.
although it's originating from the same metaphysical set of arguments by and large. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe there is a connection in that, like, personality in the sense of hypostasis is the peculiarity that stems from being unified by a particular henad, which has a personal manifestation
Yeah.
in the particular god. But
That does seem to
I
be the
would
way
digress.
people like Steve Dillon and Edward Butler are interpreting it at this point. They're
Yeah.
kind of grafting that the idea of personality back onto the idea of henads, and
Right, in a way that maybe is a little inappropriate,
I
but I do
agree.
think is there in Proclus.
Yeah.
In some sense, Proclus would probably qualify it in several other ways, whereas Butler is just absolutizing,
Yeah.
and leading to a regress into liberalism somehow.
I'm
Um,
glad you I'm glad you mentioned that because I do think that that's a major influence on his work, and I think if you read into it a little bit, you can kind of see that that seems to be what he's trying to do is kind of
he's
graft that
politically
into
motivated.
the highest, the the first hypostasis basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, Proclus would say there's a hierarchy even in the henads. He must, I
Right.
would assume.
And it's interesting the whole Henads thing. I've been kind of known, I guess, amongst the Platonists that I'm not really a Proclean Platonist or a Henologist, I guess you would phrase it. I take more of kind of like a middle Platonic stance and a Platinian stance on it. But I think everything that you've said so far can still work and apply to the way that it was understood by the Middle Platonists and even by Plotinus. Just there being a difference between, uh, what's in the first and second hypothesis for us. It's like I would say all of that's happening in the second rather than the first. Um, but that's been
Well,
my interpretation of it.
Damascus will acknowledge the henads, but he'll say that these are analytical distinctions, not ontological distinctions.
Yeah. And I
Because,
love that from him. That's kind of where I got the idea is when he talks about it that they're almost like symbolic in a sense, and
right,
they're only
he
actual
does.
in the second hypothesis. And so that's kind of where I've gone with it is taking more of that approach. And part of that's just to protect the Platinian sort of ineffability and simplicity of the one. And I know that Proclus does kind of like there's the hierarchy in there. So there's the one above the henads, sort of, and so they do have that kind of relationship still. But I prefer the more apophatic, like, oh, I'm going to leave the one alone and let it be what it is.
Right. Yeah, wherever you situate the henads in whatever hypostasis, like there does have to be though that first emanation of aspects of unity.
Hmm.
Um, just because, like, again, analytically, we can parse between a form
Hmm.
and then the unity of that form. So the forms are differentiated. Again, we can see those differentiations in our own nous. We have direct access to at least the structure of the divisions there. Um, Initially, implicitly, obviously, and then through the dialectical method, we explicate it and articulate self knowledge ultimately, but knowledge of our own intellectual nature in those divisions. So the intellectual contents, I think, can fairly be parsed from that which unifies these particular intellectual contents. And that'll be different aspects of unity. And there's some unique aspect of unity reflected in each of the forms. It's
Hmm.
like the unity that binds things together because of or for the sake of beauty, that's going to be uniting things into a harmonious whole in terms of their Mariology and mutual um, reflection or something like that. And there'll be something of that same character when it comes to friendship,
Hmm.
right? But there's an aspect of unity involved in friendship that is not as emphasized in beauty, for example. Like with friendship, obviously, compassion and theory of mind is a intrinsic important part of what actually joins us together in friendship. For a beautiful thing, like there's no theory of mind between the parts of a painting, right? So I think there are a lot of different aspects of unity, and that's for me just the basic concept of what is
Yeah.
a henad. Well,
Right.
it's this aspect of unity.
Yeah. And I mean, at some level, though, I kind of look at it like the forms are those aspects of unity. That they all have a unitive kind of nature, like beauty, and they blend into each other in a way. Like you could say that beauty is good and goodness is just and just is good and beautiful, and they all kind of reflect each other in that way and have take that kind of unitive character from the one. But I guess I just always wonder when we're talking about those unities, and maybe this goes to what Damascus is saying, is where are those unities? Are they not ontological? And we're kind of talking about them almost poetically, like that there's this unity, but it's not something that actually ontologically is there.
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that it's in a hypostasis and they're not their own particular hypostases is the difference. And I think that's what you get with the Christian account is this is a missing step somewhere along the line, how you get from hypostasis as that which stands under and like self-supporting reality
Mhm.
to hypostasis as personality. Maybe it's that there was a dialogue about or a discourse about the role of henads in individuating and holding together as whole units our personalities, like the henad of our soul, how we relate to it, and how it maybe is beyond that, self itself that's talked about in the first Alcibiades,
Mhm.
where Damascus, or no, sorry, Olympiodorus relates Damascus's opinion. We don't have a commentary from Damascus, but he relates the opinion from Damascus that we're talking about not just the rational soul with this self itself, but like a higher I forget which division specifically he
Mhm.
uses there, but like a higher aspect of the rational soul. Proclus identifies it as simply the rational soul. But then, like, when I read it, I'm thinking, do they stop at rational soul? Or because we have from other Neoplatonic authors very explicitly the idea of the henad of our soul. Proclus talks about it, Hermias talks about it.
Mhm.
So why not like situate our ultimate locus of identity not just in our rational soul, but in the henad that unifies our intellect, soul, and irrational components together? And if that's something like the notion of personality that emerged maybe after Proclus's lifetime, sometime around then,
Sure.
and then like the Christians picked up on it and that's why hypostasis took on this meaning of personality because of the use case that it had for the Platonists pertaining to human beings or
Yeah, I
something
mean
like that.
that's possible. I mean, because you certainly don't see it in the earlier Platonists. Of course, like Hermias and Olympiodorus and that kind of new academy, you do see the Henology pop up and they're talking more about henads. But prior to that, they really weren't. You just don't see it in Plotinus. You don't see it in the Middle Platonists or Plato. So and personality even that's something I've been reading a lot of Lloyd Gerson's work on Platonism and personality. And it is an interesting kind of missing component. Like it seems to them that personality is kind of the soul. That's maybe the closest thing you're going to get to it. But I get what you're saying that there's like, is it the unity of the soul? Is the wholeness of the soul? I guess is what you would class as like a personality.
Yeah. Well, my view, and I don't see evidence for this view exactly in the ancient Platonists, but it seems plausible to me that the soul is as Proclus describes it. It's an eternal, necessary mathematical structure, can't be created or destroyed, just
Hmm.
is there for all time. And yet, and he also describes that it'll go through this ascent and descent, like the cosmos and the statesman. Each soul returns to its source and then departs from its source, abides, proceeds, and reverts indefinitely. But it's sort of a fatalistic picture. If I'm just always this fixed essence, there's no real salvation. It's sort of like mechanistically, fatalistically determined that I'm going to fall. Like if I find myself at the summit, I know what's coming next.
Hmm.
But
Well, you
but
find
what
that in the
if,
Phaedrus too. It's like in the
yeah,
Phaedrus they talk about souls that get and are able to get to the peak and are able to look at the plane of truth, and it says, well, they can stay there for as long as they can hold it, basically.
right?
And the implication is sort of like you're not going to hold it forever. If you did, you'd be a
Yeah.
god.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And if that's it does make sense that there would be a logical structure that follows that paradigm or pattern. But is that us, or are we something at a deeper level that unifies that structure with our body, with our particular intellect?
Hmm.
And then that henad, like if that's what we're identifying with, we could actually shift between the level of the soul and the level of intellect. And surpass rational dianoia in terms of where we're situated, because that same henad, by the logic of the divine rays,
Right.
is there in the higher hypostasis. So we, as that henad, could actually revert back to our source in a higher hypostasis. And then maybe there's like, could we move as a henad between different souls even, and not be like trapped in just one, which the reincarnation dynamic there is very different. But I think maybe something like that could be possible.
Yeah, I mean,
But that's just
I think I see a
me.
bit of what you're saying there as far as y- you know, sometimes I think the way Platonism gets characterized, it is kind of a disadvantage if we think about it like those like concentric rings that are kind of on top of each other. Like you've got the nous, then you've got the soul, then you've got the body, and it's like they're all deeply interconnected and intertwined. It's more like Russian nesting dolls, right? Where it's like one is greater than the next and it kind of goes into each other. And so, you know, I see a lot of the relationships between them being relationships of ontological dependence. Like we're dependent upon each of those things. It's like you can't really have a soul unless there's first mind, and you can't have a body unless there's a soul. And they just kind of depend on each other. But I see what you're saying, that there's that sort of implies that there's this unity that transcends all three of them, right? And connects all three of them together. So I do see what you mean there. I guess I would say that is the one, but yeah, I think that's kind of what the Henads are saying
But
too.
then we receive limited energies of the one. Not absolutely all aspects of unity are manifested in each individual personality. It's like it's colored. I think color is a really good analogy. Or
Hmm.
like from the Silmarillion, where Tolkien describes
Yeah.
the creation of the world with these different tones. Either musical tones in combination or colors work really well. So you have this like blinding white light, and then its initial polarization into monad, indefinite dyad, and then the recombination, you get this spectrum
Right.
of different energy signals, which reflect each other. You know, just like with musical tones, I think this analogy is even better. And maybe it's that way in the color spectrum too. I would have to check the physics on that. I'm pretty sure it kind of is. But in musical tones, like different timbres, the entire overtone series is present in every tone, right? But different timbres sound different because, well, the oboe is going to emphasize like the fourth
Right.
uh, overtone of the fundamental
Yeah, I forgot to tell
more
you,
than others.
I have a music degree too. That's what I went to school for
Oh,
too.
okay,
So
cool.
yeah, I very much know what
What do
you're
you
talking about.
play?
I did play classical guitar, and it's been a long time since I've played. So
That's a shame.
maybe when the kid's older and stuff like that, I can get back into it.
Nice.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. My good friend was a classical guitarist who introduced me to like Julius Evola and
But yeah,
Nietzsche and all these guys. So,
yeah, that's a very classical guitar guy kind of thing to be into,
uh-huh.
the traditionalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I got over. I can't do the wizard nails anymore, though. If I get back into it, I'm gonna
Mhm.
have to figure something out. That whole having your right hand look like your Gandalf's, hand. It's a
Right.
little bit much for me at this point. Hard to
Yeah.
explain.
I've picked up the guitar to learn it several different times throughout my life, but I never practice it consistently enough to develop good calluses on my left hand.
Oh yeah,
And the guitar I was trying to play, it was just way too tense, I
yeah.
guess. And
The
the
action like too
strings
high.
were, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, so I would always just hurt my hand and end up giving up. But it's a
Uh,
lovely instrument.
yeah. What did you play?
So, what did I go to school for?
Yeah,
The French horn.
the French horn. All right,
Mhm.
right on.
Yeah. So, anyway, going back to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
different timbres, like reflecting each other, exactly what Proclus says about the forms reflecting each other. He says that the henads do the same thing in a superlative way.
Hmm.
So they're more intimately reflective of each other's nature,
Hmm.
and yet are also more fundamentally distinct. And I think
Yeah,
that's because like these differentiated aspects of unity are the source of all later distinction. And so because they're the source of distinction, they are more distinct than distinct things that participate in distinction.
Yeah, I think that's where
So
like Proclus sometimes loses me. It's like I definitely get the idea where you're talking about where like, okay, sure, we've got the analogy of light to, a prism kind of breaks, and it's like the one is the white light and the prism breaks and you get all of the different colors. I totally get it. But it's not necessarily like in the white light, it's like there is all of those colors in some, form like he's talking about there. They're not
yeah,
necessarily there
in a
in the
seminal
one,
form.
right? It's like you only ever notice them after that white light. And that would be for me, I guess I would look at that and go, okay, well, that's all happening within being where do we actually notice them. So I guess it just goes back to that what Damascus was saying about them being a more of a symbolic thing. But I suppose Proclus is maybe just trying to make sense of it all. It just tends to be too cataphatic for my sensibilities sometimes.
I understand that critique. And I think if you treat them, here's the maybe the error that happened where the Christians ended up with this weird notion of personality or
Hmm.
hypostasis. It's if you treat them as individuals in the way that we're individuals, then you will hypostasize them incorrectly because like the way that they individuate us is um pros heteros and it would be pros autos in the henad. It's like the distinction in the forms. It's either the form in itself or the form via your via participation.
Right.
And so the way that we participate of distinction is distinct, but the source of distinction is not a distinct thing. And
Right.
so you hypostasize the henads because in us, when we participate of a unique henad, it's a unique personality that makes us a unique being, a separate being. But
But
that's
in
it's not the
itself, it
way
isn't.
in the source, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Got it.
Proclus, to his credit, I mean, he'll constantly repeat the refrain that, like, even the summit of the intelligibles are ineffable,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
so if it's beyond intelligible distinctions, then any talk of it has to be symbolic. And so
Hmm.
Damascus is just spelling out what Proclus does indicate implicitly. However, like even if it is a symbolic or analytical distinction, the distinct tenads having an existence, I think makes sense to talk about. Just like the different attributes of God make
Hmm.
sense to discuss, like God's creative. Talking in Thomistic terms now, just to illustrate it, or by comparison, like talking about God's creative act versus God's omnipotence versus his benevolence versus his justice. I mean, Catholics are comfortable talking about these attributes of God and
Hmm.
reasoning from them too in ways that actually reflect genuine distinctions in the world.
Right.
And
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 I
yet,
related it to Palamas in that way, the sort of essence energies distinction for a
uh,
long time, that might be I do see that as kind of influenced by Proclus's theology, the idea that you have God's essence, which, yeah, that's like basically the one, and you have the energies, which have these different formal distinctions.
yeah, I think Proclus would be unsatisfied with that.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, no,
um,
I do give Proclus some credit too on all of that. Obviously, he's a brilliant guy. It's not
mhm.
that he's necessarily wrong about certain things. I think it comes down to, like I said, the sort of my tendency towards apophaticism when it comes to stuff like that. But I do. The more I've learned of what he's saying, the more I've actually come to appreciate it. And I came at it from a point where I was learning about it more from the kind of Butlerian polycentricity version of it. And that's what I had the biggest reaction to, being like, this doesn't make sense and seems to go against Platonism as far as I understand it. But I agree, Proclus is much more careful when you actually read what he's saying.
Yeah, and he will abridge concepts for the sake of, well, just brevity and the sake of the reader. Um, you see Plato do the same thing many times. Like in the chess match of the argument contained in the dialogue, there will be a branch, like, what if you take this move? And it implicitly, all of these already known Platonic concepts are there. Like, well, you would move on to start discussing either anamnesis here or whatever. But in practice, well, the dialogue, conveniently, the character answers a simple yes or no, and you like go down this path instead of digressing. Although, like, it's almost as if those possible digression points are highlighted, and there's like a pause in some sense where you could be going here with it, but we're going to keep it simple. Proclus does that explicitly, and he'll say things that he seems to contradict himself because in some places he just has to abridge the full concept and make it simpler. Like there are various henads. Well, when you really qualify it, like,
Right.
are they separate in the same sense that things that participate of separation are separate? Well, no. And do we participate of the henads, or is there another mode of ontological relation between us in the first hypostasis compared to us in the second hypostasis?
Hmm.
Well, participation as a catch-all, like sensu lato, is useful, but then he always has this like bag of sensu stricto divisions
Right.
when he needs them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it. And I don't think, I mean, it's hard to even systemize all of it into one simple package when you're talking about Proclus. There's a reason why there's these big books that you can buy to kind of try to explain it in a systematic way. And they don't even necessarily agree because there's a lot of different parts that kind of have to be reconciled. And like you said, there's a lot of little exceptions and, even poetic language at some level that he's using. Yeah.
Do you think, though, it's a different henad that unifies my nature versus the henad that unifies yours? Or is it just one henad?
Well, I don't necessarily, I guess I don't really look at it that way as far as like the way that the henads would be. Um, I guess what unifies our nature, I mean, I don't necessarily know that there needs to be a particular ontological thing that unifies our nature, I guess. And I think hidden in kind of what
And
you're
why is it
saying,
unified?
well, I think kind of what you're saying hidden in there is this idea of personality being this unifier, right? That like there needs to be this thing that unifies our personality. But I think, looking at like what people like Lloyd Gerson have talked about as far as personality and Platonism, in some sense, personality is looked at as kind of a deficiency, something that occurs by our division from the one. By being further from it, it's like we become something that has this sort of self-reflexive personality where we feel like we're this separated self. But as we get closer and more unified, that slips away essentially. Where, he's talked about where, to true noesis, if you were to be at one with the nous, you wouldn't really have personality in the sense of like an idiosyncratic personality where it's like, oh, me and my memories and that sort of thing. You would just be in a state of self-identification with what is, with being itself.
In the Timaeus, I mean, we learn that we all share the same initial birth.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
somehow we are connected, like our volitional free will aspect is connected to one and the same fundamental starting point, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's one and the same henad or what. I guess one way to look at it is that, okay, we had the same henad then, and then as you proceed and multiply, new divisions are actually created. And where do they stem from? Well, is it I don't remember where Proclus makes this argument precisely. Actually, it's not Proclus, it's Iamblichus, and it's a fragment of Iamblichus preserved by Proclus. I forget where, unfortunately, but the argument as far as like this is the Iamblichian turn about ritualistic practice rather than the
Right.
henosis emphasis of Plotinus.
Mm-hmm.
It's because the free will aspect of ourselves, because it is the leading aspect, has to be our summit. And our summit is our henad. And so if our free will distinctions or decisions generate the distinctions that characterize the particular personality that we devolve down into, then that henad, that free will decision, uh, where it departs from like the ideal man's decision making, that has to be because the whole self is altered, the whole personality is altered by those decision making moments.
Mhm.
You do have to actually radically depart from that initial joined henad and become something new and distinct and different.
Mhm.
And that would take place not just because we have different intellectual natures or different dianoetic processes, but it stems from our free will decision. So that moment, and that's also a real classic interesting moment in and where it falls in the ontology, like the fall of the soul. And I don't find any of the Neoplatonic accounts wholly satisfying there, because there does seem to be an infinite regress of like,
Yeah, what do you mean by the infinite regress?
well, when you bootstrap this fall, it makes sense to say, okay, well, there's some temptation, there's like a lesser good that appears, and then led by a moment of ignorance or like a lack of self recollection, the henad in question makes that choice, acts, exercises volition to move towards the inferior.
Mhm.
But then it's like the regress occurs where there's an epistemological deficiency first before the fall of will. And so
Right.
then you kind of need, well, what led to that moment of ignorance? Well, it's some kind of act of will that was deficient. But then what's the principle of sufficient reason of the initial decline of will that led to the epistemological difficulty that led to the, and I don't
Right.
think there's a real
Yeah, I mean,
powerful
at some level, it kind of
resolution.
rolls up to the problem of the one and the many, because it's ultimately like, what is the cause of division and all of that change? You know, even at that epistemological level, like you're talking about, it's like that's created by division, right? You go from having sort of a more universal knowledge to a fragmented knowledge, a divided knowledge where you have less than the whole. And it's the fact that you have less than the whole that allows you to be able to make an ignorant mistake where you could make some kind of error because you don't see the whole any longer. But again, you still have to
Right.
answer the question, well, why do you go from the
Right.
one to the many in the first place? Right.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if I have a totally satisfactory answer to that myself.
You know, I heard a Hindu guy talk about this once because somebody, you know, you could kind of reformulate the question a little bit, like why why is there something instead of nothing at some level? Like why is there anything at all, right? Like why does the one have any kind of change from being the one? I mean, it's not a change, right? But you could say, well, why does anything happen at all? And I really liked his answer. Some Hindu guru guy, I can't remember who it was, but he just goes like, we don't get to know the answer to that. God makes that choice and we don't get to know. It may not be satisfying,
Hmm.
um, but I don't know. It kind of struck me as like, yeah, you
There's
know, maybe that's beyond our knowledge as humans to really get
in
the
some
answer
way
to that.
that seems like a simpler question than the fall of the soul, because to my mind, you can't have categorical distinctions without a cause of those categorical distinctions. So in the first principle of all things, it can't be nothing. Like you can't just have absolutely nothing because nothing exists in a categorical schema.
Hmm.
It's also not going to be like everything per se, although
Hmm.
everything might flow from it.
Hmm.
Um, the sum of all parts is not going to be the first principle because parts are prior to the whole. So it's not nothing, but then there are no categorical distinctions that can be drawn, and so it sort of has to be nothing. But it's the negation of negation. It's like a double negative,
Hmm.
where because it can't just be nothing,
Right.
the only option for it is to be kind of simultaneously all, it's like the superposition of all categories that could be drawn, because again, like no category at all would be an answer. It would be like
Right.
it's in this class,
Right.
and
You're
then you need the
still
principle to explain that division.
right. You're still giving it something.
Yeah. So the only move is to have this kind of superposition of all the things it might possibly be. But then if it's all those things in potency immediately, what does potency even mean
Right.
unless it's actualized? So it's like the only stable, non-self-contradictory ontological thing for reality to do is to be everything, but not itself. Like the principle isn't everything, but
Right.
it has to flow into everything. It just has to.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean,
I don't even know if that's
I think you just started doing your own like Platinian rambling on that,
yeah.
right? Like
No,
you
I
just
did.
kind of go back and forth on it, and I don't think you can do any better than that. Like I think once you really start to ponder the complexity of it, that's just kind of
Mhm.
what falls out. You know, you think about
Yeah.
all those different things, and you're like, it can't be any of these things, and yet it is. You know.
Mhm. Yeah. The fall of the soul, on the other hand, seems like a more concrete application. Um, and I'd like a more satisfying answer than that, because you do run into this regress. And I guess I'm just kind of drawn back to thinking in terms of this, like either in itself or in relation to others distinction, and and also this like containing the multitude of potentialities and which one is going to collapse down. Well, if you're this archetypal man, you contain all these possibilities. Also, in the Sophist, Plato says in the voice of the Athenian stranger that, oh, sorry, not the Athenian, the Eleatic stranger.
Hmm.
He says that the best notion of like existence they could come up with is affecting something or being affected. So,
Hmm.
like,
Right.
something's being is what it causes and also what it is affected by. But if then the archetypal man is a being, well, what is he? What is the sum of that being? It's all of the possible instantiations of the archetype. It consists in like all of its possible manifestations.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so
And by the
then
ideal
when
man,
we find
you're just talking
ourselves,
about it in the sense of like the form of man essentially containing that. Is that what you mean by it?
yeah, it causally contains it. It contains it in a more unified way. But
Mhm.
then because its subsistence is in its effects, and our effects, or those effects in us involve partial limited realities that are flawed and not as unific, it like we need to be here for it to have its potency, and yet it can't simply be us, just like the reality or the principle of reality can't be everything, but it can't be nothing. The
Mhm.
form of man has to really exist. It can't simply be all of its instantiations, but it like we have to be here. And it's almost like one of these kind of kabbalistic notions. We're like we're a shard of divinity, or we're one like polarization of this whole. And I guess the decline then would be explained anthropically, and it's like it's a matter of perspective, whether we really believe in our distinct individual existence and we hypostasize ourselves,
Mhm.
then it looks like there is a real fall that has taken place.
Mhm.
But then if we stop like having that, but even then, like the same fall of the soul regress just kind of falls down into our attitude towards our fallen state. Because if we take that consistent Platinian henosis line about our condition here, well, we can just identify with the higher aspect of ourselves. Okay,
Yeah.
but is the free will decision not to do that not real? And then you get Iamblichus's argument that because our free will is our leading factor, we can't have this other higher factor that remains exempt. So I reject the Platinian henosis picture because of Iamblichus's argument in part, but then also I'm inevitably led back to there has to be a higher aspect that we're ultimately is us, And Timaeus said, in the Timaeus, it said
Right.
that is our first birth. So I don't know. I guess this puzzle is not totally resolved in my mind, but
No, I think it's a
it's
good thing
interesting.
to ponder. I mean, I definitely fall on the side of the sort of divine shard way of looking at it. That, yeah, that each one of us are kind of that little shard of the divine. You see that in the sort of Zagreus myth with Dionysus, being torn
Hmm.
apart by the Titans. There's kind of a mythical metaphor for that of, we're all part of that. And our reunification is, in some sense, the disillusion of that in a way, and I don't think it means that you necessarily, it's not the Hindu necessarily drop of water in the ocean idea. I don't even think that that's really what Plotinus is saying about kenosis. He does seem to suggest that, I think the way he phrases it is that you're as close to the one as you can be, except in otherness. It's basically what he says. It's like there's still some sort of sense that you're not that. So there's something there. But I think it's interesting what you're saying about Iamblichus and the free will. I got to really go back to that and just see, how he figures that into theurgy. I had never really thought about the existence of free will being the major driving factor of theurgy, or why theurgy needs to work.
Right. Yeah, because if we had the resources for our own salvation, that would imply this superior element of the soul was there, just ready to be tapped into. That's why Platinian Henosis is available.
Right.
But then, if our free will aspect is our leading aspect, then there can't be this other perfect thing because our free will is flawed. And so that means if our
Right.
leading aspect fell, then how could, like, every other part of ourselves also has to fall. So we are wholly fallen. There's nothing up there for us to, there's not
Right.
like a golden thread for us to tug on to get back.
The whole
So
descended
therefore,
soul idea, like where you're down here and that part is not there anymore. I mean, I've always wondered about that too. I guess from taking a more divine shard kind of perspective, I do look at it much more like that shard is there. It's not necessarily that it's you can just tap into it though, in the sense of like, oh, I can just grab that whenever I feel like it. It's more that like there's all of this illusion on top of it, and there's all of this, misidentification that's gone on, where going back to the one in the soul is more of a process of negation, right? It's this process of recognizing, oh, I gotta move away from all of the things that are not that, but I'm tied to those things for all of the reasons of the sort of fall idea, that you become attached to your material body, your material life. You even become attached to your personality and all of these different things that you associate with yourself that aren't that. And so it's like a purification process that gets you there.
right. Yeah. Our, the will to continue being here, being constantly exercised, is a kind of compatibilist middle ground position, maybe, where it is the case, like our will, if it's coming from that henad, and that's the leading part, then it's sort of the will of that divine man too, or the will of God,
Mm-hmm.
because we're a shard of that. But our particular act of will, this is also related to divine antinomy, where like God can have, or just higher things generally can have conflicting attributes in one and not tear apart. Like, in material things, we can't have hot and cold in the same place. But
Mm-hmm.
in the laws of physics, the same thermodynamics covers hot and cold.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Right.
opposites are joined in a unity. Well, the various contradictory acts of will, where like I can't choose A and B at the same time, it's impossible for me as a finite individual.
Mm-hmm.
But because that's whatever I do pick is just one aspect of a higher will, it's one shard of a higher will. And here I'm
Mm-hmm.
also equating like a particular fallen henadic state with a particular gesture of will or decision, trying to remain faithful to that Iamblichian argument and keep
Mm-hmm.
that logic alive. Because I think there's something to it. And then I like Schopenhauer. So the idea
Mm-hmm.
that like we are what we are because of some primordial act of will, and then all
Mm-hmm.
lower distinctions are like dependent on that, is appealing to me. But you can have this middle ground where It is your sustained act of like rebellion against the divine, your sustained act of my myopic
Mm-hmm.
fixation,
Mm-hmm.
that the will towards the lesser,
Mm-hmm.
that in the divine is going to be this superlative care that he exercises for all creatures. God
Yeah.
loves you more than you love yourself.
Right.
Well, for that to be real, it's like every kind of self-love, even the like delusional or self-harming aspects of self-love, have to be there, but perfected and holistic. And yet, for the perfected and holistic paradigmatic aspect to be there, it has to have all of its effects because it consists in its effects. So it has to remain exempt from the consequences. So it's always there perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it is also fully there in divided reality, even more than we are. Um, and so in that sense, like we are still like our paradigm is still there immutably, it's there perfectly,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the same free will actor that we are in some sense. It's just you're talking about an act of will in relation to things versus the will in itself, which contains all of those antinomies and contradictions and
Yeah.
possibilities.
I think that's a
Maybe
good way to
that,
put it. Yeah. I agree.
okay. But I really want to convert you to be a henodologist. So would you, I mean, the particular disposition or act of will is going to be different than the intellectual consequences of that, right? Probably.
What do you mean? I'm not sure I
Like, is
follow.
will prior to representation?
No, I don't. I don't
No.
necessarily think so.
No.
And it's funny as you were talking about will a lot. I started thinking about it as, I don't view will as being as central to the cosmos. I think that in some sense that's a very Christian notion that will has this very like important ontological space and that it's part of creation and everything and at the very root of everything. Where I don't necessarily look at it that way. I think rather than will, I look at it more as being and not necessarily it being like a conscious will. And maybe you mean something different than volitional will when you're saying that.
Yeah, I think volitional will is downstream from will itself. But what does will? The good, right?
Sure. Yeah.
All will. And so any departure from the good, like there's going to be that tension where you are drawn back to fulfillment of that good. And so that in that sense, I would say will is prior to representation because representational contents are intelligible. That's the second hypostasis.
Hmm.
Whereas will in itself would have to be that good. Um, I guess it wouldn't have to be, but the natural way to interpret it for me would be that these like states of will, it's you're proceeding from the good, and there has to be a reversion back to the good. So will consists in that separation from the one and the good, and then being drawn innately back to it.
So in that sense, are you kind of saying that what constitutes like the unlimited, the boundless, is at some sense will?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then, but I would say that limit has to be prior to the boundless still. And so I guess there's two aspects, just like Eros, there's two aspects. There's providential Eros and then the Eros of deficiency. Well, the will to create super abundantly would be like the limiting aspect, which lays down finite structures inferior to the principle of limit, but also which have goods inherent in them. And then the unlimited aspect would be more that eros of desire and deficiency, striving back to something that it's alienated from, other from, um, something like that. But that's related to the same notion with there has to be a set of intelligible characteristics in a form. It's not just intelligible characteristics, free floating, they are unified. And what unifies them? A particular henad. In other words, a particular act of will, or really a twofold act of will. One creative to beget something that I guess glorifies the nature of the one and the good in a partial way, and then the other, the deficient desire, the tension between like the intelligible form being drawn back to the unity that it contains, but in a particular way. And I think analogously to the way that we have our individuating acts of will that make us who we are, and that act of will is prior to our contents because they're just causally downstream. And so whatever, I guess it's metaxic between the one and the forms, like what bridges that gap?
Right.
Eros will, but then also there's, what does that look like other than, I guess, viewing it as a process? You have this Eros, the flux and reflux between first and second hypostasis, but viewing it statically, what does that spectrum look like? The flow between the one and the many? Well, it's going to look like the ones.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah,
Not buying it?
no, no.
All right.
No, I get to
Fair
a point
enough.
where like I do get what you're saying, and I understand the argument as far as, you're essentially looking for this kind of like bridge between it. I was talking about this with somebody the other day, and I think the way, again, like I'm open to the idea in a very like kind of metaphorical, poetic, symbolic kind of way. But the problem I run into is if we're going to talk about the one as being something that is truly ineffable, that is beyond description or determination, I don't see how those ones can be in that state in any meaningful way. At one level, they're either going to collapse back into the undifferentiation of the one, in which case we say, well, maybe they're symbolic or we don't notice them at the second hypostasis. Okay, maybe that's the case. Or if we do assert that they do have this sort of a absolute differentiation between them, then I don't see how we haven't divided the one in some way. And I think what we end up having to do is either push the one off further and say, okay, we got to push the one off into a little bit further out metaphysically. And at that point, we've essentially created a new hypostasis. We've created this hypostasis between the one and nous, which is like the Henadic realm or something like that. Yeah.
Hypostasis, right?
Yeah. And so that's the problem I see. And I don't know that there's necessarily, I agree that there are these problems when you're talking about Plotinus and creation. And when you think about like that initial moment, whatever you want to call it, where the superabundance of the one is, it's like, it's not even necessarily, it is nous, I guess, but it's nous even in like a very undifferentiated state. There are certain logical, there's something about that I don't know, it's like an itch you can't scratch, like what is not quite there. But I'm still not convinced by the henads as the answer to that problem.
Yeah, I would say that ultimately the one is undivided. But when we talk about it, the one in itself, all language will be metaphorical, even the language of it being a one, Damascus and
Sure.
problems and solutions. Or,
Neither is nor is one.
Yeah. So, or even the Parmenides, is Plato already, picking up on that? And so, insofar as we can talk about the one in itself, we almost can't privilege the oneness of the one versus the manyness of the one. Almost. And then
Yeah.
with respect to other things, its participants, I think it's more reasonable to like recognize the priority of the one, because just mathematically, like you have to have the one to have the other numbers. It's
Sure.
necessarily first, but then also ethically, like when you are in unity with your friends, that's a good thing, and we can just empirically um, infer the nature of the one versus the many.
Mm,
But there's also real distinctions beyond the one. We know that the one being uh, supreme has to
mm,
have all of the genuine power that lower things do, and then some.
mm.
Um,
Insofar as,
because
yeah, like it's the productive power of all things.
Yeah, and so whatever power I have to produce is pre-contained in my source.
Mm,
This is like Proclus's, I think the specific argument is that if it was possible for something to create something with greater potency than itself, then it would first use that creative power to perfect itself, because everything seeks its own perfection before it
yeah.
goes on to proliferate.
Mm,
So, if that logic holds, then, and um, the one has all power in itself prior,
mm.
with respect, I lost my train of thought again. With respect to us, I'm almost
Right.
like trying to get at this like pros
Yeah.
auto, pros hetero thing in itself. With respect to us, in itself, we can't call it a one or a many
Right.
strictly. In relation to others, we can see that the one predominates, but also there are real distinctions. And like there are real distinctions that add to the value of the cosmos at our
Mm,
level. So we know that all of those real distinctions that add to the value of the cosmos are there causally contained in the one as it relates to us in
sure.
participation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that you've introduced real distinctions into the one.
Yeah. So, I guess the way that I would look at it and the way I do look at it is the nous is essentially that Hananic realm that you're describing. Like that is actually where all of that's happening. And that's the place where that's happening because we don't have any problems anymore when we're talking about a one many. Like Plotinus calls the nous a one many. And that's exactly what it is. It is both one and many simultaneously. And even in Aeneid 5:8, he talks about it where he's talking about the noetic gods, the intelligible gods that are like statues of light that are kind of beaming light into one another, and everything is seen by everyone, and that kind of idea. And to me, I think that that is just a great description of what usually we're talking about when we're talking about the henads. It's like they are distinct, they are one, but they are many simultaneously, and that seems the right place to put that idea rather than something in between. And I guess I'm interested from you being on the Proclus side of things. Like, what is it about the nous that you feel doesn't or cannot fulfill that capacity?
Basically, so the logic where if you have like AA and BB, generally there's going to be an intermediary AB
Sure.
substance because of the communion of all
Yeah.
things.
Right.
So the one is AA in the sense of, let me start with the nous side of it. So the nous is intelligibly differentiated and unified in a particular way. BB. And then AA is generically unified, not particularly unified, and super intelligible entirely. So there's going to be AB that is particularly unified, but super intelligible.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand that kind of logic, but I think the problem is, aren't we treating the one like it's a thing when we're doing that? Like we're treating it as though it's something that has this direct relationship to nous rather than something that wholly transcends nous altogether, right? Like to me, sometimes looking at that equation, and I've heard that a couple times, I almost think about it like you have this equation for how all of that works. The analogy to the one for that equation would be like the white paper that equation is written on. Right? It's like it's the ground that makes that kind of logic even possible in the first place. And so just
And I would
it's not necessarily
say
part of it.
that's the in itself of the one is the paper that's written on. but then there's the one in participation,
Right.
participated.
Yeah. And to me, I would say, okay, that one in participation is essentially like the one being, which would just be the unity of nous as one.
Hmm. But being is one
Mhm.
by participation.
In the one, I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. So the one in participation can't be the same as nous because the kind of participation that nous has of the one is beyond itself.
Sure. I mean, I still look at it though, then, okay, you can have the one that produces the one being, the nous. And then from that, you have the one that then we have this relationship of categories to where it splits from one into many. But the only, right, like it's almost like in the analogy that you were saying, like a one would produce things like itself, it would produce other ones, other unities. I would say no, the one produces a one, right? You have the one produces the one being. And from there, that's where the multiplicity then spreads.
But
It's
if the
not,
one is a one and many, then
but
it'll produce.
I wouldn't say the one is a many.
So you are not with Damascus there.
No, I guess I wouldn't be.
Okay. Well, I mean,
Are
I
you
guess I
saying
would go
like the
back
one
to
is a
my
many in the sense that, he talks about the three henads as like the limited, the unlimited, and the mix, that kind of
Mhm.
that idea. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I would say no. I would go back to Plotinus, right? And just be more go with the divine simplicity and apophaticism about that.
Right. But the paradox is to say divine simplicity is like kind of cataphatically asserting simplicity over multiplicity.
Hmm. Yeah.
So just do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I
I
guess
guess
I
you
did
can.
do that.
I mean that's a viable move.
Yeah.
And I feel like for the sake of logical consistency, it's probably worth taking. But I like this aspect of the Damascian one where it's metaphysically inescapable. Like it shouldn't be possible, the genuine first principle, it shouldn't be possible to assert the opposite of it where it doesn't hold. It's because it shouldn't fall in one categorical distinction over another. It should be beyond all categorical distinction. And any assertion you make of it, you kind of would equally have to be able to make the opposite assertion
Right. And
for it
that's
to be
where he goes
ultimate.
in and just, he says it's the ineffable, right? He's not even going to call it the one because he's not even
Right.
going to put anything on it. And
Hmm.
I like to think I'm doing the same with that because I'm not necessarily saying that it is a one um, at the exclusion of a many necessarily. I do think it's just a completely transcendent thing, and any of those categories that we're going to put on it they're going to fail. Like we can kind of say that poetically and it makes sense, but I don't think it actually makes sense in any kind of
Right.
logical way.
But you think it does make sense to say that the one creates the one noose, and that's
It's more that the first thing created or the first thing that is a one. Like
yes,
if I just didn't bother to say it comes from something because it doesn't necessarily as some kind of like efficient cause come from it. It just the one being is, and the ground of that is what we call the one. It could equally just be the ineffable.
right. The first essence is definitely one.
Right.
There's no question of that for me.
Hmm.
But then whether essence exhausts, I mean, what do you think about the essence existence distinction?
I'm not sure I'm that familiar with it. What do you mean?
Well, just like the notion. So does the sophist definition of existence apply beyond essences, or because I think the one exists but it's not an essence.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's such a good question about like, does the one exist? I was just having this the other day with somebody. one way I've thought about it is kind of more that it's super existence and not necessarily existent as, because we always get into this problem with Greek where it's like, what do we mean by it? Are we talking about ontos, like toon? Are we talking about ousia? And I think there's other words that they use for existence. And I find it interesting that they have all these different terms, and we typically just collapse it into being. It's like that's being. So I'd say it exists in some kind of way, but in an ineffable kind of way. It's like we only know that it exists because it is the ground of and exists, the ground of being, and being exists. So it's a something, I guess, but it's a something nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the sophist definition is really good for existence as, like, I guess, toon. And I would say that, in the Republic, when Socrates says that maybe the one is beyond being, he is saying that maybe there's something beyond essences. And that's like mind blowing to Glaucon because all the dialectical method is about describing these particular essences, which are really defined by what they're not in the same sense of not the same apophatic sense, but they're kind of defined by what they're not, as in like there are these generative distinctions that produce the essences. And so it's like when you add a differentia, you substantiate the essence. And each essence is the genus and the differentia that composes it. And so any particular essence is what it is because of the differentia that differentiates it from others.
Hmm.
I wonder about the first essence, though, whether I mean, obviously it has no genus.
Right.
And I guess it does, in a way, it has a differentia because we can distinguish it from all other things subordinate to nous. Um, and yet not having an essence, or sorry, not having a genus,
Hmm.
it wouldn't have a definition.
Right.
Um, that that's also sort of a fuzzy area. Like existence versus essence is fuzzy. Now the distinction between essence and definition, that's, is it a one-to-one relation where everything with an essence has a definition? Or
If we're talking about essence as like a sort of noetic essence, like a formal reality, I
Mhm.
would say no. I mean, even going to Parmenides and the idea that, there isn't a form for like dirt and dust and, the little minutia of
There's
the
no
universe.
definition of those either.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess the definition is vague at best, I guess. I don't know. I mean, you can kind of say what like maybe mud or dirt is. But
Description, they can have a description but not a definition.
all right, that's fair. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in the strict sense, I guess you would need a genus and differentia to have a whole definition, and then you have an essence. But that would
Hmm.
imply that the first being, the first essence, doesn't have a definition, and so then isn't quite an essence because it doesn't have a genus that it belongs to and doesn't have a um, differentia in the same sense,
I guess it's kind of the essence of essence, if anything, if that,
right?
right? It's the basis of that. But I guess its only definition then would just be that it's not being,
Yeah.
right? Which is probably the
Interesting.
most simple thing that you could say about it, right? Like it is. Like if it has any kind of definitional quality, it's like it
I
is.
am that I am.
Hey.
We covered a lot of interesting ground here,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
and yeah, we should definitely talk again. And this has given me a reason to reflect more on the fall of the soul and the problem of the one and many and all of that stuff. And in what sense do henads exist?
Hmm.
And it's probably inexhaustible, but I'm definitely sure like I'm not close enough to the right answer
Sure.
yet. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, we should definitely have another talk. There's a bunch of questions I wrote down, and I don't think I got to any of them. But that's good. We went on a good rabbit hole with all of that, and yeah, there's plenty more we could talk about. So yeah.
all right.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Sounds
All
good, Eric.
right.
Take
Thanks.
care.